"We can't miss Lucas's opening performance," my mother said while my 2-year-old son lay in an emergency room waiting for blood that could save his life. I thought she was joking at first. I actually stared at her through the hospital lobby glass doors and waited for the smile that never came. My father stood beside her with his car keys already in his hand, avoiding my eyes the same way he had my entire childhood whenever my mother decided something unpleasant was easier to ignore than confront. Ethan had been admitted less than an hour earlier. One moment he was sleepy and warm in my arms, the next nurses were rushing him through double doors while monitors beeped around us in sharp mechanical bursts that made my chest tighten every single time. The pediatric specialist explained everything quickly but calmly. Ethan needed blood immediately because his levels had dropped dangerously low after a severe reaction to a medication he'd been prescribed earlier that week. They were already contacting the blood bank, but because Ethan had an uncommon blood type, they asked if close relatives would be willing to test first. I called my parents without hesitation because my mother had the same blood type. I still remember how relieved I felt when she answered on the second ring. "We're nearby," she said. "Lucas has his national dance finals downtown, but we'll stop by first." At the time, I thought stop by meant help. I thought it meant family. I was wrong. Daniel sat beside me in the waiting area with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. My husband had barely spoken since we arrived. Every few minutes he looked toward the ICU hallway as if he could somehow will someone to come out with good news. I kept checking the elevator doors. Every time they opened, my heart jumped. Then finally I saw my parents walking through the lobby in expensive coats, my mother carrying one of Lucas's glitter-covered garment bags over her shoulder like tonight was still the most important event in the world. Relief hit me so fast it almost made my knees weak. "Thank God," I whispered as I hurried toward them. "Mom, they just need to run a quick test. They said you're probably a match." My mother's expression tightened immediately, not with concern for Ethan, but with irritation. She glanced toward the giant wall clock behind me. "Claire, we already checked in downstairs," she said quietly. "But Lucas goes on in 40 minutes. I blinked at her, confused. "What?" My father finally spoke without looking directly at me. "Your brother's been preparing for this competition for almost a year." Somewhere behind me, I heard an intercom paging another doctor overhead while nurses pushed equipment down the hallway. The smell of antiseptic burned the back of my throat. "Ethan could die waiting," I whispered. My mother sighed softly, like I was being unreasonable. "Don't say things like that," she replied. "The hospital will figure something out. We can't abandon Lucas right before he performs." Then she reached over and squeezed my hand gently, the same way she used to when I was little and crying over disappointments she expected me to accept quietly. "Try to stay calm," she said. "We'll come back afterward if needed." And then they walked away. I stood there frozen beside the sliding hospital doors while my parents crossed the parking lot toward the glow of downtown lights, leaving my son behind for a dance competition. The hospital hallway felt colder after my parents left. I sat beside Ethan's room with my arms wrapped tightly around myself while the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. It was almost 9 o'clock at night, but the pediatric wing was still full of movement. Nurses walked quickly past carrying clipboards and medications. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried for several minutes before finally settling down again. Everything around me continued normally while my entire world felt suspended in place. Daniel stood near the vending machine staring at his phone without really looking at it. Every few seconds he rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he was trying not to panic. I could tell he wanted to say something about my parents, but he kept stopping himself. That almost made it worse. I think part of me still expected my mother to come back through those sliding doors at any second and say she had changed her mind. I kept imagining her rushing toward me apologizing for leaving, saying of course family mattered more than a dance competition. But every minute passed quietly. At one point, I opened social media just to distract myself for a moment. I wish I had not. Lucas had already posted a video from backstage at the convention center downtown. Bright stage lights flashed behind him while dancers stretched and laughed around him. My mother's voice echoed somewhere off camera. "That is my boy," she said proudly. Underneath the video, she added a caption with 3 red heart emojis and the words, "Big night for our superstar." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Ethan was connected to monitors and oxygen tubes less than 15 miles away, and my mother was cheering over sequins and trophies. Daniel finally walked over and gently took my phone from my hands. "Do not do this to yourself right now," he said quietly. I nodded, but my chest still felt tight enough to crack open. A nurse named Angela came over a few minutes later holding a clipboard against her navy blue scrubs. She looked tired but kind, probably in her early 40s, with silver strands already appearing in her dark hair. "We are still checking nearby blood banks," she explained softly. "And we have also sent out an urgent donor request through the regional network." I swallowed hard. "How long does that usually take?" She hesitated just enough to tell me the answer was not good. "Sometimes quickly," she said carefully. "Sometimes longer." Daniel sat beside me and reached for my hand. His palm felt cold. "He is strong," he whispered. "Ethan is strong." I looked through the small window in the ICU door. Ethan looked impossibly tiny lying in that hospital bed surrounded by machines almost larger than he was. His favorite stuffed dinosaur rested beside his pillow because one of the nurses had noticed me clutching it earlier and quietly placed it next to him. That small kindness nearly broke me more than anything else that night. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed again. For one stupid second, hope shot through me. But it was only my mother. "Lucas. Made finals," the message read. "We probably will not leave until after midnight. Keep us updated." I read the text twice in complete silence. Then I locked my phone and slid it face down onto the plastic chair beside me. Something inside me shifted quietly at that moment. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a cold understanding settling deep into my chest. My parents had made their choice hours ago. And for the first time in my life, I finally understood that no matter what happened to me or my son, we would never come first. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents walking away through the hospital parking lot while Ethan lay upstairs connected to machines. Around midnight, the waiting room became quieter. The television mounted near the ceiling played some late-night sitcom with the volume low enough that I could only hear bursts of canned laughter every few minutes. A janitor slowly pushed a mop bucket down the hallway. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine hissed and clicked. Tiny ordinary sounds that somehow made the loneliness feel even heavier. Daniel finally convinced me to eat half of a granola bar from the vending machine because I had not touched food in almost 12 hours. I chewed mechanically without tasting anything. My stomach felt hollow and tight at the same time. At around 1 in the morning, Dr. Reynolds stepped into the waiting area still wearing blue surgical scrubs beneath his white coat. He crouched slightly in front of me so his voice stayed calm and level instead of rushed and clinical. "Your son is stable for now," he said gently. "But we still need to secure a proper blood match as soon as possible." Stable for now. I realized hospitals used phrases like that when nobody could promise anything. Daniel thanked him while I just nodded silently because I was afraid if I opened my mouth, I might completely fall apart. After he left, I rested my head against the cold wall behind me and suddenly remembered another hospital waiting room from years ago. I was 16 and sitting alone after spraining my ankle during a volleyball game at school. My parents had not come then either because Lucas had a regional dance showcase that same night. I remembered watching other girls leave with worried parents carrying flowers and overnight bags while I sat there balancing an ice pack on my swollen ankle waiting for a neighbor to pick me up. At the time, my mother told me I was old enough to understand sacrifice. Your brother has real opportunities ahead of him, she had explained on the drive home later that night. You are stronger than he is emotionally. I used to believe that was supposed to be a compliment. Looking back now, I realized it had always been permission to neglect me. The memories kept coming after that. Every birthday dinner moved because Lucas had rehearsals. Every family vacation centered around dance competitions in different cities. Every achievement of mine quietly pushed aside because something involving Lucas seemed bigger, brighter, more important. When I got accepted into nursing school, my father mailed me a congratulations card 3 weeks late because the family had been traveling with Lucas for nationals in Chicago. When I announced my pregnancy with Ethan, my mother spent most of dinner talking about Lucas auditioning for a touring company in Los Angeles. Even after Ethan was born, she referred to him as Daniel's side of the family's little boy more often than as her grandson. I do not know why I never fully saw it before. Maybe because some part of me kept hoping things would eventually change. Maybe because children spend their whole lives wanting their parents to love them equally, even when the evidence says otherwise. Around 1:30, my phone lit up again with another social media notification. Lucas had posted a photo holding a silver trophy while my mother stood beside him smiling so widely her eyes nearly disappeared. My father had one arm proudly around his shoulders. The caption read, "Could not have done it without my amazing family supporting me tonight." I stared at the photo for several long seconds before quietly locking my phone again. Then I looked through the ICU window toward Ethan sleeping beneath pale hospital blankets while machines blinked softly around him. And for the first time in my life, I stopped wishing my parents would choose me. By 3 in the morning, the hospital waiting room looked completely different from when we first arrived. The front desk lights had been dimmed slightly, and most of the chairs around us sat empty except for a man sleeping beneath a gray sweatshirt near the corner television. Outside the tall lobby windows, rain tapped softly against the glass, turning the parking lot into blurred reflections of red brake lights and wet pavement. Daniel had finally fallen asleep sitting upright beside me with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I envied him for managing even a few minutes of rest. My own body felt exhausted, but my mind would not stop moving. Every time a nurse walked through the ICU doors, my pulse jumped. Around 3:15, Angela returned carrying 2 small paper cups of coffee. She handed one to me carefully before sitting down beside me for a moment. "Still no family available to donate?" she asked gently. I stared down at the dark coffee surface for a second before answering. They had somewhere else to be. She did not ask more questions after that. I appreciated her for it. Some people know when silence is kinder than sympathy. A few minutes later, another nurse approached the desk carrying a folder and quietly spoke to Angela. I watched both their expressions change slightly. Not panic exactly, but urgency. Angela turned back toward me. "Claire, we may have someone responding to the donor request," she explained. "He is driving in from about 40 minutes away." Relief rushed through me so suddenly I nearly started crying right there in the waiting room. "Who is it?" I asked. She gave a small apologetic smile. "We do not know him personally. Just someone registered through the emergency network. A stranger. Some stranger in the middle of the night was willing to drive through rain toward a hospital for a child he had never met while my own parents sat applauding under stage lights downtown." I wrapped both hands around the paper coffee cup because they had started trembling again. Daniel woke up shortly afterward and listened quietly while I explained. He closed his eyes for a second and nodded slowly. "There are still good people in this world," he murmured. Around 4 o'clock, the elevator doors opened and an older man stepped into the lobby wearing faded jeans, work boots, and a dark green rain jacket still damp from the weather outside. He looked to be somewhere in his late 60s with broad shoulders and tired blue eyes. Angela immediately stood up and walked toward him. A few moments later, she motioned gently in my direction. "Claire, this is Walter Hayes." Walter gave me a small nod that felt strangely comforting. Not dramatic. Not overly emotional. Just steady. I heard they needed O negative, he said quietly. I have the same type. For a second, I could not even speak properly. You drove here for us? I finally managed. He shrugged slightly as though it was the simplest thing in the world. For your little boy, he corrected softly. Not for you. Children should not have to wait for help. Something about the way he said it nearly broke me apart completely. Walter followed the nurse down the hallway for testing while I sat frozen in my chair staring after him. Then my phone buzzed once more. Another message from my mother. Lucas won first place tonight. We are all going out for pancakes to celebrate. I looked at those words for a long moment beneath the harsh hospital lights. Then, very calmly, I turned my phone off completely for the first time all night. Walter turned out to be an exact match. Around 5 in the morning, Angela came back into the waiting area with a tired smile that immediately softened something inside my chest. The donation process has already started, she told us quietly. Your son should begin receiving blood very soon. Daniel covered his face with both hands and exhaled shakily beside me. I did not realize until that moment how tightly I had been holding myself together for the past several hours. My entire body suddenly felt heavy with exhaustion. I leaned back in the plastic hospital chair and stared up at the pale ceiling tiles while tears slid silently into my hairline. Not loud tears. Not dramatic ones. Just quiet relief finally escaping after an entire night of fear. About 30 minutes later, Angela brought us into a small family consultation room with beige walls and a coffee machine humming softly in the corner. Walter sat there holding a foam cup in both hands. Up close, he looked older than I first thought. The deep lines around his eyes and mouth reminded me of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors under harsh weather. But there was kindness in his face too. The kind that feels steady instead of performative. Thank you does not feel big enough, I told him honestly as I sat down across from him. He shook his head once. You do not owe me anything. Daniel reached forward and shook his hand firmly anyway. You saved our little boy tonight, he said quietly. Walter looked down at the coffee cup for a moment before answering. I could not save mine. The room fell silent after that. He explained slowly, without self-pity, that his grandson had passed away years earlier after complications from a rare medical condition. There had been delays finding the right blood match during a severe winter storm. I still remember sitting in a hospital hallway wishing somebody would walk through those doors, he said softly. So when I got the emergency alert tonight, I came. I looked at this stranger sitting across from me in faded work clothes and rain-damp boots and suddenly felt something I had not expected after a night like this. Shame. Not because of anything Walter had done, but because I realized I had spent most of my life begging for basic love from people who treated it like a burden while complete strangers offered kindness freely without asking for anything in return. Walter asked to see Ethan before leaving. A nurse escorted us quietly into the ICU room where morning sunlight had just begun creeping through the blinds in thin pale stripes. Ethan looked small beneath the blankets, but the color in his cheeks had improved slightly. The monitors no longer sounded frantic. Walter stood beside the bed for a long moment with his weathered hands resting loosely in front of him. Then he smiled softly. There you are, buddy, he whispered. Keep fighting. Something about that simple sentence nearly broke my heart open again. Around 7 in the morning, my phone finally buzzed after being turned off for hours. Several missed calls from my mother filled the screen along with one voicemail. I listened to it standing beside the hospital window while the city slowly woke outside beneath gray rainy skies. Claire, you really scared me shutting your phone off like that, my mother said immediately, sounding irritated instead of worried. We wanted to stop by after breakfast, but Lucas is exhausted after last night. Call me back when you can. I listened to the message twice in complete silence before deleting it. Then I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked over to Ethan's bedside where Walter was carefully adjusting the stuffed dinosaur near his pillow like he had known my son forever. By late afternoon, Ethan was finally sleeping peacefully without nurses rushing in and out of the room every few minutes. The constant alarms and urgent footsteps from the night before had faded into softer sounds now. Monitors beeped steadily beside his bed while sunlight stretched across the hospital floor in long golden rectangles. Daniel had gone downstairs to bring back coffee and clean clothes from home, leaving me alone beside Ethan for the first time since everything happened. I sat quietly in the reclining chair watching my son breathe. Every now and then, his tiny fingers twitched against the blanket while he slept clutching the stuffed dinosaur Walter had carefully placed beside him earlier that morning. The sight of it sitting there made my chest ache in a strange way. My own father had never once brought Ethan a toy. Not on birthdays. Not at Christmas. Nothing. But a man who met him less than 12 hours ago somehow noticed exactly what comforted him. Around 2 o'clock, there was a soft knock at the partially open hospital door. I looked up expecting another nurse, but instead my parents stepped inside carrying balloons and a small gift bag covered in silver stars. My mother smiled carefully the moment she saw me, the same tight controlled smile she always used whenever she wanted to smooth over something uncomfortable without actually discussing it. "There is our brave little guy," she whispered as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. My father stood awkwardly near the doorway holding a coffee tray from the hospital cafe. I stared at both of them in complete silence. My mother walked toward Ethan's bed and adjusted one of the balloons tied to the chair. "Lucas wanted to come," she said casually. "But he is exhausted after the competition. The poor thing barely slept." Something inside me almost laughed at that. Poor thing. My son had spent the night in intensive care while my brother celebrated trophies and pancakes downtown, yet somehow Lucas was still the person she pitied most. My father cleared his throat quietly. "How is he doing now?" he asked. "Better," I answered shortly. "Because someone showed up for him." The room went still after that. My mother's expression shifted immediately. Not guilty. Offended. "Claire, do not start," she said softly. "We came as soon as we could." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Her expensive cream-colored sweater. Her freshly styled hair. The professional manicure she somehow still found time for that morning while I sat in the same wrinkled clothes from the night before praying my child would survive. "No," I replied quietly. "You came after breakfast." My mother crossed her arms tightly. "That is unfair. Lucas had one of the biggest nights of his life." I glanced toward Ethan sleeping beneath pale hospital blankets. And Ethan almost lost his. My father shifted uncomfortably near the wall, but as always, he stayed silent. He had spent his whole marriage mastering silence. My mother let out a slow breath like she was dealing with an irrational customer instead of her daughter. "The doctors told us the hospital was handling things," she explained. "We knew there would be other donors." "There almost were not," I said calmly. "A stranger drove 40 minutes through the rain to save your grandson while you were cheering at a dance competition." Her jaw tightened instantly. "You are trying to make us feel guilty." I looked down at Ethan's small hand resting near the blanket. "No," I answered softly. "I think you already should." For the first time in my entire life, my mother did not have a response ready. Ethan remained in the hospital for 3 more days before the doctors finally said we could bring him home. By then, the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones like cold winter air that refused to leave. Daniel handled most of the discharge paperwork while I carefully packed Ethan's tiny clothes into the overnight bag we had thrown together in panic earlier that week. The same dinosaur Walter adjusted beside Ethan's pillow never left his side once. Even during naps, Ethan held on to its little green tail with stubborn determination. Walter visited every afternoon after work. Sometimes he brought coloring books. sometimes small toy cars from the dollar store near his house. One day he arrived carrying a faded baseball cap from an old minor league team and placed it gently on Ethan's lap like it was treasure. Ethan smiled at him in a way I had never seen him smile at my father. Open. Immediate. Safe. Meanwhile, my parents behaved as though enough time had passed for everything to return to normal. My mother started sending cheerful text messages again filled with recipes, shopping sales, and photos from Lucas's competition weekend. In one picture, my brother stood beneath bright stage lights holding his trophy while my parents smiled proudly on either side of him. Such a special family memory, the caption read. I stared at those words for a long time before quietly deleting the message thread altogether. 3 days after Ethan came home, my mother called insisting we join a family dinner Sunday evening. Lucas wants to celebrate his win properly, she explained. And everyone misses seeing Ethan. I almost laughed out loud hearing that. Misses him. The same people who walked away from him in a hospital lobby now suddenly wanted family pictures around the dinner table again. Daniel watched me silently while I listened to my mother speaking. After I hung up, he leaned against the kitchen counter and folded his arms. You do not have to go, he said carefully. I looked toward Ethan sitting on the living room floor stacking colorful plastic blocks beside Walter, who was pretending to lose every single game on purpose just to hear him laugh. No, I replied quietly. I think I do. Sunday evening arrived cold and windy. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it had my entire life. Warm yellow porch lights. Trimmed hedges. The smell of roast chicken and rosemary drifting through the kitchen. Everything perfectly arranged on the surface like always. Lucas was already there wearing a fitted black sweater and talking excitedly about scholarship offers from dance academies in New York and Los Angeles. The silver trophy sat proudly in the center of the dining room table like another family member. My mother kissed Ethan dramatically the moment we walked in. Grandma missed you so much, she cooed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Ethan turned his face into my shoulder instead of responding. I noticed the brief flash of annoyance cross her expression before she covered it with another smile. Dinner continued awkwardly at first. My father discussed football scores. Lucas described backstage rehearsals in exhausting detail. My mother kept refilling everyone's wine glasses as if normal conversation could erase what happened at the hospital. Then Lucas lifted his glass proudly. Honestly, winning nationals felt like the best night of my life, he announced with a grin. The entire table went quiet after that. Daniel slowly set down his fork beside his untouched potatoes. My mother glanced nervously toward me for the first time all evening. And suddenly I realized something important. They were not uncomfortable because they regretted their choices. They were uncomfortable because my silence forced them to finally sit inside the truth of what those choices looked like. My mother recovered first. She always did. The moment silence became uncomfortable for her, she immediately reached for control again. She laughed softly and waved one manicured hand through the air as if Lucas's comment had simply landed badly. Oh, do not look so serious, everyone, she said brightly. It was a wonderful night for this family after all. I watched her carefully across the candlelit dining table. Even now, she still believed this was fixable through tone and presentation. She thought if the napkins stayed folded neatly and everyone kept speaking politely enough, then reality itself could be rearranged into something more convenient. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his chair and glanced toward me for the first time all evening. Claire, I did not know things were that bad with Ethan that night, he said quietly. Mom told me he was stable. My mother immediately jumped in before I could answer. Because he was, she insisted quickly. The hospital already had things under control. Daniel let out a short breath beside me, not quite a laugh. More disbelief than anything else. I reached down slowly and opened my purse resting beside my chair. The room became very still, watching me pull out a folded stack of hospital paperwork and place it carefully beside Lucas's trophy in the center of the table. My mother's smile disappeared immediately. "What is that?" she asked sharply. "Ethan's emergency intake records," I answered calmly. "Time stamped from the night you left." Nobody moved. I unfolded the first page slowly while the soft sound of silverware and distant kitchen noises from neighboring houses drifted faintly through the windows. "Critical blood shortage risk," I read quietly from the report. "Immediate donor assistance requested." Lucas stared down at the papers in front of him. "Wait," he said slowly. "You mean there really was not a donor available?" I looked directly at him. "Not until Walter arrived after driving 40 minutes through a rainstorm." My father finally spoke up from the far end of the table, his voice low and uneasy. "Your mother thought there would be backup options." I nodded once. "And if there had not been?" No one answered. The silence stretched long enough for the grandfather clock in the hallway to chime softly twice. My mother's face hardened next. Defensive now instead of polished. "You are turning this into something cruel," she snapped quietly. "We made the best decision we could with the information we had." I looked at her for several seconds before speaking again. "No," I replied softly. "You made the easiest decision for Lucas." That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Lucas slowly pushed his trophy farther away from himself on the table without realizing he was doing it. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked proud. He looked uncertain. Almost sick. My mother noticed immediately and turned toward him. "Do not start blaming yourself too," she said quickly. "None of this was your fault." "I know," I answered before Lucas could speak. "It was never his fault." Then I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a folded photograph Angela had taken on my phone at the hospital. Walter sat beside Ethan's bed wearing his faded green jacket while Ethan smiled weakly beneath the blankets holding onto the stuffed dinosaur. I placed the picture gently beside Lucas's trophy. "This man met Ethan for the first time at 4 a.m, I said quietly. "And he still treated him like family faster than any of you ever did." Nobody touched their food after that. My mother stared at the photograph with her jaw clenched tightly while my father kept his eyes fixed downward at his untouched glass of wine. And Lucas, the golden child my entire family revolved around for decades, suddenly looked smaller sitting there beneath the dining room lights than I had ever seen him before. We left my parents' house less than 20 minutes later. Nobody tried to stop us. My mother remained seated at the dining room table with her spine perfectly straight and her lips pressed tightly together like she still believed silence could somehow protect her from consequence. My father quietly carried our untouched dessert plates back into the kitchen without saying a word. And Lucas just sat there staring at the hospital photograph beside his trophy as though he no longer recognized either one of them. The drive home felt strangely peaceful after that. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while Ethan slept in his car seat, clutching the stuffed dinosaur against his chest. Daniel rested one hand lightly over mine on the center console, and for the first time in days, neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. Some truths change everything once they are finally spoken aloud. After that dinner, something shifted permanently inside me. Not rage. Not revenge. Just clarity. I stopped calling my parents after that night. At first, my mother sent long messages pretending nothing serious had happened. Recipes. Vacation photos. Links to articles about childhood vitamins and preschool programs. The same shallow normalcy she always used to avoid accountability. When I did not respond, her tone slowly changed. "You are hurting this family. Ethan deserves grandparents. You are being dramatic over one difficult evening." I read every message exactly once before deleting it. My father never contacted me directly at all. Somehow that hurt less than it used to. Lucas surprised me, though. About 3 weeks later, He showed up unexpectedly at our front door carrying no trophy, no performance bag, none of the polished confidence he usually wore like armor. He just stood there in jeans and an old sweatshirt looking tired. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. We sat at the kitchen table while Ethan colored beside Walter in the living room. Walter had become part of our routine so naturally it almost felt strange remembering we had not known him before the hospital. Some mornings he stopped by with donuts. Other afternoons he taught Ethan how to toss a baseball in the backyard. Ethan started calling him Grandpa Walt completely on his own one day, and Walter had to look away for a second before answering because his eyes filled with tears. Lucas noticed all of it silently from the kitchen table. Finally he looked down at his hands. "I did not know," he said softly. "I swear to you, Claire, I did not know how serious things were that night." I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. My parents had spent so many years protecting Lucas from discomfort that he genuinely never learned to question the way they prioritized him over everyone else. "It was never your job to know," I told him quietly. "It was theirs." Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes red around the edges. "Mom told me you were overreacting because hospitals always make things sound worse than they are." I almost smiled at that. Even now she still needed reality softened into something easier to live with. Before leaving, Lucas walked over to Ethan and crouched beside him on the living room rug. "I am glad you are okay, buddy," he whispered. "Sincerely." Ethan handed him a green crayon without hesitation. Children forgive so easily when adults still cannot. Months passed after that. Seasons changed. Ethan grew stronger. Life moved forward quietly in ways I never expected. Sometimes late at night I still thought about that hospital lobby and the moment my parents walked away. For years I believed blood was what held families together. Obligation. History. Shared names. But I understand differently now. Blood may make people related. It does not make them loyal. It does not make them kind. And it certainly does not make them show up when it matters most. A stranger did that for my son. A stranger chose us without hesitation. In the end, that was the night I stopped grieving the parents I had and finally accepted the family I deserved.